Hey, Scott, I've got a message of someone in the waiting room. Can you let them in? I can't seem to.
Just let him in. Thank you.
Well, don't see. Oh, I think that might have fixed it. Okay.
No, I got him.
Okay.
So is everybody ready in person? We're assuming everybody's ready Zooming. We've got about 10 people here in the classroom, Neil. So
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to give you a good introduction, Neil, but let me just say, first of all, thanks for being able to parachute in and do this for us. I had talked with our mutual friend Jennifer Seal, who is also involved a lot in the Montgomery County water issues and challenges. And she had recommended you. And so one of the aspects of the water discussion that I thought was important for all of us here, a large majority of the chapter lives in Montgomery County. We have some in North Harris County, some in Walker County, but a large component is here. And especially since there's water conservation issues and discussions on subsidence and water use in Lake Conroe and flooding and San Jacinto River, I thought it was really important for this chapter to hear about challenges in their specific area. So that's why we were terribly happy to have you join us. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and take it away.
Okay. Can you see my screen? That's the important thing.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks, Scott. I'm Neil Gaynor. I'm a retired geologist, undergraduate work degree from University of Melbourne, along with a diploma in education from University of Western Australia and a PhD from UT in Dallas. Had 40 years in oil and gas and took early retirement in 2013, and then ran for office on our local Mud 6 in the Woodlands, and now there I'm president. So I have a lot of interest in water issues, and let us get going. So if I can get this to advance, there we go. So it's not an exact quote from the Apollo 13 mission, but Houston, we have a problem, and it's illustrated by this postcard of a flowing artesian well back in 1910, at a time when everyone thought, oh, there's no end to this, and people just let their wells flow. And in about 5 to 10 years, most of the artesian wells stopped flowing, and people realized we do have a problem with groundwater and its overuse. So, general outline today, and I'll speed through the hydrological cycle because we've already seen that, but just want to put that as a backdrop on some questions to think about. Ownership, which has been touched on by Ron already, and I really want to jump back into what are the underpinnings of owning and managing groundwater in Western society and Texas in particular. And then we walk back from the human world to reality. I will go in a little bit deeper into groundwater than what we've seen just yet. Talk about Texas and groundwater management, and then coming closer to home, how local groundwater is managed in the Gulf Coast aquifer, and we will summarize at the end. So the key point of this slide is to illustrate the fact that groundwater is that precipitation that's seeping into the soil, infiltrating into the underground rock formations, percolating through them, and that's what we call groundwater. So when we use groundwater, we are intercepting the natural hydrological cycle, and that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. So we have had some discussion around groundwater, and the question I have, how could anyone claim to make a claim to water in a cycle? And I mean from precipitation out of the sky down to the ocean. And then as we go through the exercise here, we'll ask the question, which part is owned by Texas and by whom, and how does such ownership come about and what are the ramifications? And there are some very serious ramifications. So I want to start with a review from ancient to modern times of groundwater in Western society. And this is an image of the court docket from the 5th District Court of Appeals that went to the Texas Supreme Court. Went there in 1903, and there was a ruling made by the Texas Supreme Court on June 13th of 1904, and they used English common law to say, well, groundwater is subject to what is called the rule of capture. And I thought to myself when I first read this, what the heck has English common law got to do with Texas? Because it's had a quite different history, and we'll go into that. But we need to start back in time when laws were being developed, laws of ownership, and trying to understand what the earth was about. And going back to ancient Greece, and with water, there are three figures come to mind. One is Homer, and that's a version of whatever he looked like. But all these three guys look the same, if you know, beards, etc. Homer is best known for his the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he also worked on other issues and developed ideas about groundwater and the source of groundwater. Oceanus was mentioned in the Iliad. And then closer to our time, about 2,500 years ago plus, Thales realized there was great value in deep flowing water. And so that brings some attraction, shall we say. If something is valuable, then the ownership will bestow value on the owner itself. But let's remember the four elements, of which water is one, that people believed in back in the day. And it was thought that this water was boundless. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams come from, there they return again. And you know, some of you will know where that comes from. Now, one of my personal heroes, Aristotle, in the time frame around 350 BC, developed a first pass at the hydrological cycle, so-called the condensation theory. And what I find profound in his thinking was that he realized that rainfall alone was insufficient to keep rivers flowing. And so keep that in the back of your head, because we'll get on to a discussion about what is actually going on in streams and rivers with respect to groundwater movement. So Roman law, moving forward, in 450 BC, Roman legal scholars created the 12 tablets. And part of what was in these legal codes was laws relating to water. For example, a remedy for damage caused by diversion of water, rights vested in land ownership, which included water, and this thing called aqueductus, related to costs and the burden of aqueduct maintenance. And of course, you know, the Romans were famous for their engineering and moving water around through their empire. Later on, Roman jurists began to codify these laws, and judges made the law binding. And there was an important code that was developed, the so-called Theodosian Code, in 438 in the Eastern Roman Empire, by Emperor Theodosius II, and there's his face on a gold coin at the time. So they this emperor merged previous legal codes and established the first concrete link between water and property ownership. So if you own property, you could own the water on that property and under it. And then finally, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Institutes and Digest of Justinian, Emperor Justinian, modernized, if you will, much of this code and reformed it. So in parallel to these laws being developed, the ancient philosophers were also thinking about what we now call hydrogeology. And Vitruvius, and that name should be familiar to you, the Vitruvian man, if you will, described how water percolates from mountains through rock formations to emerge as springs and streams. And that's in his book, De Architectura Libri Decem, the 10 books of architecture, and that's in book 8. And then Seneca realized also that rainfall does not account for all the water in surface water courses and rivers. And he thought the groundwater was being, moisture being forced out of the earth. Well, it wasn't quite correct, but it does really draw our attention to ideas that groundwater was a very important part of water sources. Now, to go into a little bit deeper into the Justinian Code, and you'll see where I'm going at the next slide. And here's a illustrated copy of those codes from a 13th century manuscript. And this code is the basis of today's laws related to groundwater. And I won't quote go through all of these, but the combined legal code, I'll read this out, negates action against landowner for non-defective work, even if there's a loss of water from a neighbor's stream or well, or for other damages. And just a minor backstory, extraordinarily, this code was not fully translated into English until the last century, which I find extraordinary. So we are moving to Texas, and I call this the moderns, adoption of English common law, and this was a head scratcher. Soon after Texas became independent from Mexico, it adopted English common law, and it was one of the first legislative acts of the Congress in the Republic of Texas. And an anecdote, it is said, a complete translation of Spanish civil law was alleged not to be available at the time, so the Texas Congress did what was pragmatic. So they adopted English common law, which is now central to today's legal issues with water and especially groundwater. And here's what happened. The Justinian law related to water was incorporated into the common law of England around 1250. That's Henry de Bracton, and there's a print of his incorporation of those Justinian laws into the laws of England. So whatever happens over there in English common law will impact what happens here in matters related to legislation and court rulings on water issues. So this is where we will now draw the direct line in how Texas manages water. And this is all about the rule of capture, or the so-called English rule. Now, there was an action court case in 1843, Acton versus Blundell. A coal miner cut off water to a neighboring cotton mill. And the court found that anyone who owns the surface may do what they want. You can dig below the surface and just use whatever is found. And here is the critical piece. If he intercepts or drains off the water collected from underground springs in his neighbor's well, this convenience falls within the description of damnum absque injuria. In other words, Latin for loss without injury. And this really is at the core of how groundwater is being treated and managed in our state. And I do love the quote from Benjamin Franklin: "When the well's dry, we know the worth of water." So moving from England to the west side of the pond, we have a ruling in the Supreme Court of Ohio in the case where a Mr. Brown cut off the water from a farmer whose name was Frazier. And the ruling in that Supreme Court, and we'll go into what this all means in a second, the law recognizes no correlative rights in respect to underground waters percolating, oozing, or filtrating through the earth. And then underground water so secret, occult, and concealed that any attempt to manage it would result in hopeless uncertainty. And then here is the thing. Percolating water is to be regarded as part of the land itself, to be enjoyed absolutely by the proprietor within whose territory it is. So when there's this discussion about correlative rights, it's a legal principle where landowners share a resource and they must limit their use to a reasonable amount. And that's commonly related to the area of land. And this is the basis of what's called the American rule, or the rule of reasonableness. And one comment, back in 1861, of course, geology as a science was not nearly as well developed as today. And if I can put in an editorial comment, the description secret, occult, and concealed is oddly quaint at best and gratuitously ignorant at worst. That's my thoughts on that. And then finally, the absolute ownership of groundwater of the landowner is affirmed. And now let's go forward now to 1904, the town of Denison and the Paw Paw Formation. In 1904, the Texas Supreme Court affirmed the rule of capture that we've talked about, that came from English common law, in the case of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad versus East. So Denison, Texas, back then, at the turn of the 20th century, was a railroad hub, and it wanted to be the premier town. And so there were multiple rail lines going through Denison. And there's an advertisement for Denison that I found on the internet, that come and secure health, wealth, and happiness come. So, and there's a little town just to the south of it called Dallas, but obviously it was not an important city at the time. Denison was the center. Anyway, railroads, steam trains, need a lot of water. And so the Houston and Texas Central Railroad dug a big well with a steam pump to produce 25,000 gallons of water per day. And then Mr. East's well dried up. Now, I've got a little section here showing the relative positions of Mr. East's well, and it's not quite clear from the records if it was 100 feet or up to 250 feet away from the railroad well. And the Paw Formation consists of sand at the top, right under the surface, more clay-rich sediments below, but still with some sand, and then there's an impervious layer at the bottom. Now, Mr. East could only dig through the sand, but the railroad company could dig all the way down and capture all the well. So Mr. East sued, and the case went through appeals and ended up at the Supreme Court. And let's see what they said. So here's the precedent in Texas for the rule of capture. The Texas Supreme Court hammered, set in stone, cemented the foundation of the Texas groundwater law, the rule of capture. But here's the extraordinary thing. Even though hydrogeology and geology had advanced significantly, they were still quoting the words from the Ohio Supreme Court: secret, occult, and concealed. But there's something good about this decision. In the absence of positive authorized legislation, as between proprietors of adjoining lands, the law recognizes no correlative rights. So in the absence of positive authorized legislation. So the Texas Supreme Court was in effect inviting the Texas legislature to act on issues regarding the rule of capture. I think they may have been sympathetic to Mr. East, but obviously the law at the time was one based on English common law, which, as we recall, in 1840, the Congress of the Texas Republic made it part of their own law. Now, the court indicated that it would follow precedent, the stare decisis. So the rule of capture has precedent over the rule of reasonable use. Now, keep in mind, there is this question about the Supreme Court inviting the legislature to act. So we'll see where we go from there. But we have a backstory, which I always like. There's always more than one angle to some of this. Here's a map showing where Mr. East's property is in this shaded area here. Here is the location of the railroad well, that 22-foot wide well. This is a pumping station, a steam pump to pump water over to the railroad tracks, the railroad property, which is over here. These are contours of distance from the railroad well. And we don't know where in this property Mr. East's well was located. But here's an important thing. There was a creek, Paw Creek, flowing through his property. And it could well have been that this creek was the source of water for his well and also the railroad's well. Now, in 1901, when all this issue came up of wells drying up, there was a severe drought in Texas. And on the right side, there's a couple of maps showing, the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Basically, if it's red, it's bad. And so through most of 1901 into 1902, it was very, very dry in that part of Texas. So that it could well have been that the well dried up, not only due to the pumping by the railroad, but also there's a lack of water source because of the drought. So let's go forward 95 years to 1999. And Supreme Court of Texas, this is the Cipriano versus Ozarka case, which was decided on May 6th of that year. And we'll see just in a moment what was decided. But during that intervening period between 1904 and 1999, the Supreme Court of Texas determined that the rule of capture is not absolute and that there were three exceptions: to injure a neighbor by taking their water, willfully or wantonly wasting water, groundwater, and negligently causing subsidence. And notwithstanding the intent, these are very challenging circumstances to prove without question. So this is our fast forward again. The setting was in Henderson County. That's up in East Texas, well, to the north of us, more or less. Ozarka drilled a number of wells and began pumping 90,000 gallons of water per day, every day. And then Mr. Cipriano and his neighbors, the Fains, their wells all dried up. And so they sued, and the case ended up in the Texas Supreme Court in 1997. Now, the Court of Appeals appeared to be sympathetic to their case, saying, for so well settled law as the rule of capture, we conclude that it would be more appropriate for the legislature or the Supreme Court of Texas to fashion a new rule if it should be more attuned to the demands of modern society. And that was quoted in the ruling by the Supreme Court, but they ruled against the plaintiffs. Basically, the Texas rule of capture is the law of the biggest pump. If you can pump it on your land, it is yours. It doesn't matter what you do, except for those three narrow exceptions of deliberate injury to your neighbor, wantonly, wastefully using that groundwater, and then excuse me, hang on, let me go back, make sure I get this. And oh yeah, negligently causing subsidence. So you have to do, you might cause subsidence, but you've got to, by your actions, negligently cause subsidence. So the core issue is, and it remains that today, should Texas abandon the rule of capture even with those limitations and instead adopt the rule of reasonable use? Well, all the Western states of the United States that are mostly relatively dry, Texas, all moved to the rule of reasonable use. Texas is the lone holdout for the rule of capture. So just coming back to reality, as I like to think of it, won't go through this, but the water cycle is certainly complicated, and there are so many ways of moving water around in this cycle. And this is obviously from USGS. What's important about this is that, as it says, you may not be able to read this, but this diagram shows the Earth's natural water cycle, omitting the significant impacts of human influence. So the part that we influence strongly is intercepting the groundwater recharge and flow part of the cycle. And we'll get into that discussion right now. You've seen this slide, and the only reason I'm showing this slide is to point out just how much of groundwater, that is to say water we can use, is under the ground, in rock formations under the ground. So we want to dig into that in a little bit. So where is the water? Well, this was mentioned, it's in aquifers. And this is a diagram from the USGS showing the different kinds of aquifers that are in our area. And again, focusing in our area. So there are two types of aquifer: a confined aquifer that's bounded by impervious layers, and that's under significant pressure. And the unconfined aquifer, or water table aquifer, right here. And this aquifer receives its water by percolating water through the soil, that's this dark orange color, through the rock formations until the rock formation is fully saturated. Whereas the confined aquifer receives its water from a recharge area, and that water runs down underneath the confining zone. And so this is where we have highly pressurized water. And commonly, in the early days of exploiting groundwater, we had our flowing artesian wells simply let flow. And the level to which artesian wells would have water rise in the wells was far higher generally than water table wells like here. So an aquifer is a geologic unit that can store and transmit water, usually in unconsolidated deposits. That's commonly the case, but it can also be in cavernous limestones, etc. Now, the confining units are also called aquitards. They don't they can transmit water, but they don't store very much of it. Mostly they're shales and clay. So if groundwater is not in underground streams or lakes, where is it? So groundwater is in the pore space of aquifers. So what is a pore space? The pore space is the voids between rock grains. And the diagram on the left is trying to illustrate a case where if we have a cubic meter of sand and we fully saturate it with water, we don't, in this case, 0.3 cubic meters of water, we don't end up with 1.3 total volume. No, the water will occupy the void space between the grains, and we end up with 1 meter of saturated sand, in which we can determine the porosity to be 0.3 or 30%. And porosity is expressed as a decimal fraction or percentage in both ways. A simpler way to understand it is just take a beer glass, fill it up with gravel, and weigh it, and then add water so that the gravel in the sandy gravel is fully saturated. Calculate the amount of water, the weight of the water you added, and then you can readily calculate the porosity. In this particular case, it was 28%. So the important point is the porosity is completely occupied by water, and so this unit is said to be fully saturated. There's another concept that is important, and that's storativity. Storativity is the volume of water which an aquifer releases per unit area drop in water level. And I have two examples here. One is a water table aquifer. The other is the confined aquifer with a confining unit on top and bottom. In a non-confined water, when you drill a well, groundwaters are released from storage by dewatering the aquifer. And all that means is you're draining it by gravity. And the storativity of unconfined or water table aquifers can be 0.1 or 0.3, which means you're capturing most of the water in the pore space. In an unconfined aquifer, you have a huge issue. The storativity of a confined aquifer is far less than typically is far less than the storativity of the unconfined aquifer. And why is this? You are not draining the aquifer by gravity, because the aquifer remains 100% saturated. In a confined aquifer, groundwater is released from storage by compression of the pore space. You're compressing the aquifer itself, which means you're decreasing the pore space, you're compacting the aquifer in essence. And what does compaction imply? It implies that eventually land will subside. This is also the case for unconfined aquifers where you depressurize the unconfined aquifer as well. So 2 slides coming up on groundwater flow dynamics. And again, another hero, Henry Darcy, was a French engineer back in, he worked back in the middle of the 19th century. And he worked for the city of Dijon in France on their waterworks. And he wanted to understand what was the process by which water flowed underground to the fountains within the city. Back in the day, people got their water from public fountains, not like we have today, where there's a network bringing water directly to your home. But he developed Darcy's law, which is the foundation of quantitative hydrogeology. And if you focus your attention on the left side of the screen, there are 2 important concepts to keep in mind, and it's just 2. One is the hydraulic gradient, or the slope of the water table, or the water pressure surface, which is simply the ratio of the change in height of the water table over distance. The second important concept, permeability. That's the ability of a sediment to transmit a fluid, and that's dependent on the interconnectedness of the void space, the pores in that sediment. So a gravel will have a high permeability, allowing a lot of fluid, water to pass. A sand has less well-connected pores. It will have less permeability as a result. And then silts, very fine grain materials, have the lowest permeability, the least ability to transmit fluid. So Darcy conducted an experiment, and we won't go into details, but he set up a reservoir, kept at a constant level, and allowed water to flow through a cylinder of sand. And he measured what was the discharge coming out the other side. And he plotted up the data points for a water level kept constant here of 1. There was a certain discharge, and with that particular hydraulic gradient, which was low, it plotted in this part of this graph. And then level 2 at a constant, and then level 3. And as you can see, there's it's a straight line proportionality in which discharge is related to hydraulic gradient by a constant, and that constant proportionality is permeability. Those are the only 2 things you need to concern yourself at this time with groundwater. Everything else is ornamentation beyond that. You've seen this slide from Ron. What I want to emphasize here is that there is strong interaction between surface water and groundwater in two ways. The first is recharge of aquifers. So water must percolate down through the phreatic zone into the water table and then further underground. And then the second is discharge from springs or into streams and lakes. And that is shown on the diagram on the right-hand side of the diagram here. Then coming back to what Aristotle and Seneca were talking about thousands of years ago, there is indeed a groundwater component of stream flow. And the USGS conducted a 30-year study of this phenomenon. And they found in their study that the range of the groundwater contribution to streams was 14 to 90%, with a median groundwater contribution of 55%. So in the diagram shown here, we are plotting time in days at the bottom. This is for a full year. And flow in this particular stream, it was the Homachito River in Mississippi. And you can see there are times when there was quite a bit of rain, most likely. And so there was a pulse in the total stream flow. And then here at the base, the lowest part of the stream flow, so-called base flow, water continued to flow even though it wasn't raining. And that was the paradox that Aristotle and Seneca were trying to understand back in the day. And this base flow is the contribution of the total stream flow due to groundwater influx, and it can be significant. What is important in this diagram, you'll see over time, over this year, that the base flow is decreasing, as is the amount of rainfall as implied by the peaks in the total stream flow. And then there are long periods where there's very little rain, and then it's a relatively constant flow. So groundwater is moving steadily, and then it picks up again when there's more rainfall, it would appear. This is a map from that same study, and it is showing these pie charts are showing the contribution of groundwater to stream flow. And I'm picking out a number of these rivers. The Dismal River in Nebraska, that's at this location, gets most of its water from groundwater. Down here in Texas, the Frio, the dry, gets what, about 55 to 60% of its water that flows in the stream from groundwater. And then here is the river we just looked at, the hydrograph we just looked at, the Homachito River, getting perhaps 40% of its water from groundwater. So this is where we humans intercept the natural cycle. And from wishing well to industrial scale, we access the groundwater by digging or driving pipe or drilling. And the industrial scale world will produce large volumes, but you got to drill quite well. So there's quite deep. So there's a cost to that well drilling. But there's even a worse cost than that. The graph in the center here is showing the amount of water permanently lost underground in the Central Valley of California from about 1925 or so to 2015. 140 cubic kilometers of fresh water was lost due to unsustainable pumping. And that's well over 4 full Lake Meads. That's an awful lot of water to be lost. Now, you'll notice that there were a number of periods of drought, and during those drought periods, the graphic at the bottom is showing, as we might reasonably expect, that if there are droughts, then groundwater pumping increases dramatically. The vegetables and other plant material, crops need their water. So how are they going to get it? You're just going to pump it. Now, this isn't restricted to, this issue of depleting groundwater is not restricted to the Great Valley of California. What this map is showing is the overall permanent groundwater depletion in many aquifer units throughout the United States. The red colors, red, orange, and yellow, are showing a range from 10 to 400 cubic kilometers of loss of groundwater. So there's two areas in the Mississippi Valley and in the Texas part of the Ogallala Aquifer has had, those two areas have had the largest loss of groundwater. And there are other regions that have had similar losses. And there are some areas that have actually gained, up here, for example, in the Northwest. But overall, the pattern looks pretty dismal. And even down here in Texas, in our neck of the woods, on the order of 25 to 50 cubic kilometers of groundwater have been depleted. And that's not really that big a surprise when you think back to that postcard I showed you early at the start of the presentation. People just left their wells open, and there you have it. So let's talk about the consequences. Talked about drawdown of the water table by pumping. The water has to go somewhere. It's coming out your pumping well. It's going onto the surface, and not very much of that will ever head back because you're providing it to plants. And as you know from Ron's presentation, the plants do a very good job of evapotranspiration. So that water is in essence lost.
So done speaking.
So, hello? Anyway, just to go on, here's an example of a groundwater decline of the static water level in a well in Memphis, Tennessee. So over time, it had dropped, maybe a little under 100 feet. But when the water level declines, the pressure in the aquifer decreases. And for poorly consolidated geological formations, especially fine grain formations, the space between grains, in this case, starts to collapse. And so the grains become much more aligned, much more regularly. And as a result, the aquifer, especially the fine layers, compacts, and then the overlying land surface will permanently deform, as we've seen in Houston, as Ron was explaining to you all. And we're seeing that same kind of thing up here in our part of the world. So let's think about the consequences of groundwater depletion. Spectacular ones are in the West, typically, because that's where the effects are most prominent, is that, pump enough water, you'll dry up everything. And here's the Santa Cruz River near Tucson. This rock is this rock, okay? So basically you can see all the vegetation, no problem in 1942. And then, 47 years later, it looks like scrubland. There's just desert, nothing much left of that. The other impact can be faulting and ground fissuring, as shown in this example. And then, most extraordinarily of all, in the Great Valley, in this particular instance, there's regional scale subsidence. And this dog is, this is not a water hydrant. This is the top of a water well. And it's now 10 feet up in the air. This picture shows the ground surface as it would have been in 1925, 1955, and when this photo was taken in 1977, here's a person for scale, and that's probably 30 feet plus of subsidence over that period. But it has continued. Here's a person holding a indicator showing the ground level in 1988 all the way to 2016. And it's not just simple subsidence changing, for example, drainage patterns and things. You can have damage to infrastructure, such as shown here. Now, something that we would be familiar with over in our neck of the woods is land subsidence. And the poster child of subsidence in this country is the San Joaquin Valley. That's the southern part of the Great Valley. And this is subsidence rates in the San Joaquin Valley over the period of 2 years. So the red colors are showing 250 millimeters per year. That's 25 centimeters. That's a little under 10 inches of subsidence per year, going down to perhaps less than 50 millimeters or a couple of inches per year. But these areas of significant subsidence are closely matched to areas that have the highest pumping rates. And extraordinarily, when you slow pumping down, things settle down quite well. This is just showing the amount of displacement, vertical displacement at these locations, P1, let's see, P2, P3, P4, and P5. So Texas and groundwater management. The bottom line is Texas responds to managing groundwater only after crises. Invariably, these crises are droughts, and we can identify different kinds of droughts, but they're all interrelated. But the one that impacts us, or the two that impacts us, are the hydrological drought. Well, they all impact us in a way. But the socioeconomic impacts, health, well-being, quality of life, and the economy, we really feel it when a drought happens. And an extraordinary example was when the Brazos River ran dry in the drought of 2011. Here's the Brazos River in Knox County, and Knox County is right here on the map. So not quite to the Panhandle, but in North Texas there. And that was the year of exceptional drought in Texas. Practically all of the state that year was in that state of exceptional drought. So what I did was go back to the data, looking at Texas droughts since 1892, and I plotted up the number of climatic regions, and there's 10 of them in Texas, that had drought conditions for a particular year. And what I've highlighted, so these are all the numbers of climatic regions year by year that experience drought conditions. And the colors are simply showing if there were 5 or more climatic regions. I'm just highlighting those. You will remember there was a drought in 1901, which is arrowed here. 6 climatic regions were impacted by drought in that year. Going forward to 1917, the entire state, all the climatic regions were impacted by drought. Now, in the 1950s, we had the so-called drought of record, where there were multiple climatic areas impacted by drought. And that is, again, another example of the entire state being in severe drought. And then we saw just now the 2011. So we will see coming up the response of Texas to these circumstances. And this is the timeline I put together for legislation on water. In 1917, we had conservation reclamation districts formed. 1919, again, after that big drought, the creation of freshwater supply districts. We continued to develop water control improvement districts in the 20s. After the Dust Bowl, the San Jacinto River Authority was created. That's the river authority in our area. In 1949, because of issues with managing groundwater conservation districts were created. The most critical one, I think, is in 1957, after the drought of record, the Texas Water Development Board was established for water planning for the whole state. 1991, what is now the TCEQ was established, and that was after the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts at the federal level were authorized. Regional water planning groups were established in 1977. We'll talk about those in just a minute. 2001, the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District was approved by voters, and then to manage all of these various groundwater conservation districts, groundwater management districts were authorized in 2005. So the two key state agencies that have oversight of water and groundwater are the Texas Water Development Board. Obviously, I mentioned water planning, but they also do project financing and technical assistance and so forth. And the TCEQ, primarily it's a regulatory function, including licensing, permitting, and reporting. And they really do have significant authority to regulate water and enforce. And they also are an enforcement agency. In our area, 3 agencies are the SJRA, and their role is to assure long-term water supply for our part of the world in Montgomery County. The GMA 14, Regional Groundwater Management, in ensuring groundwater districts are working well together for the benefit of all the people. And the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District, whose role, presumably, is to preserve, conserve, and protect Montgomery County's groundwater. So, thinking about the state water planning, we've heard that we go through 5-year cycles, water plans, as well as groundwater plans. And the map on the left is showing the water planning regions. We are in Region H, just down here in Southeast Texas. These regions develop regional plans, which are then integrated into a state water plan. And I noticed Terry mentioned that there's a and during Ron's presentation, there is a draft 2022 state water plan available on the TWDB website. And I urge you to read that so you can really comprehend how complex water management issues are in Texas. And from that draft state water plan, I pulled this particular diagram. And what it illustrates is the relative demand on water by category. And here is the most significant change in red, which is municipal. We're going to have a huge population boom in Texas by any projection. And so today, in 2021, we need approximately a little over 3 million acre feet. That's going to more than double by 2070. So there's a really good question you might ask: where's it going to come from, all this water? Similar to the water supply for the overall water supply, groundwater planning goes through 5-year planning cycles. And the groundwater management areas shown on this map in the dark outlines use a joint planning process for groundwater conservation districts to develop an overall management strategy. And they do that by assessing available groundwater and developing what are known as desired future conditions, or DFCs. And the map also shows the in the shaded areas where there are groundwater conservation districts, or in the case of Houston, Galveston, and Fort Bend down in this area, where there are subsidence districts. Now, again, from the draft state water plan, we have the existing supply shown and the available supply. The important thing is, in both instances, availability will be less over time, and the supply will be less over time. And of course, these are in acre feet, and you can see how large an acre foot is in terms of gallons, a little over 325,000 gallons. That's a lot of water when you multiply these numbers out. So let's get right down to where we live. This is a map of the outline in yellow of the Gulf Coast aquifer, and there are two parts to it in terms of the distribution of fresh water, which is less than 1,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. And there's showing a blue dashed line here. South of that, the water becomes slightly to moderately saline, so a little bit over 1,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. Here's Montgomery County up here, up in the northeast part of the Gulf Coast aquifer. And again, coming down, we got to think about what are these aquifers. I mentioned they were geologic formations. And this is a map of the geologic formations that comprise the Gulf Coast aquifer sediments. And these are shown in this brace here. So basically from the Beaumont, Lissee, Willis, Goliad, Lagarto, Clay, and Oakville, and down to the Catahoula, which is not a very permeable unit. But these 4 geologic formations comprise the Gulf Coast aquifer. And 2 formations, all these formations receive water from rainfall, and they form an arc, more or less, their outcrop, that more or less parallels the Gulf Coast, hence the term the Gulf Coast aquifer. So in the dark orange brown, that's the Lissee formation. Underneath it is the Willis, then the Oakville, and further south, it's also called the Goliad. And then we get into the Lagarto clay and Catahoula up here. So I'm going to show you a section through here showing the main aquifers in our area. Here's Montgomery County. This is us up here. Oh, by the way, the vertical scale here has been stretched over 50 times. So if this was a one-to-one scale, you would barely see these units. They're so relative to the horizontal distance, they're so thin. So the Chico aquifer in pink here is the shallowest aquifer, followed by the Evangeline, the Burkeville confining unit. So the Chico, Evangeline are water table aquifers. The Burkeville confining unit confines the water in the Jasper. So it is a confined aquifer system. This is where the Jasper gets its recharge, which is north of Montgomery County, and from the Burkeville confining unit all the way to the Gulf, the Chico and Evangeline are getting their recharge from the entire area. So one of the things that has occurred in the woodlands and in other areas has been a significant depletion of water levels in our aquifers. I'm only showing the Jasper aquifer here. So the depth of the water is the scale on the left-hand side, and these squiggly lines with all the different colors, they refer to that depth under the surface. This curve is referring to the demand of gallons per year in the woodlands. So as the woodlands grew, the demand grew and grew. Here is the 2011 drought when, for obvious reasons, people wanted to water more, so there was greater demand made on the aquifers. Then in 2015, you'll see the sudden drop in groundwater demand. And that was because surface water, shown in the red line, was made available to the woodlands and other utility areas in southern Montgomery County. What is extraordinary about this is that, first up, under normal use, the water level was dropping at 12.5 feet per year. But when conservation started to kick in, we saw stabilization, and then especially once surface water became available, there was even a slight rebound in the water levels in the Jasper. Now, we did talk, Ron talked earlier, and I mentioned it, that water recharges from the surface, from precipitation, into aquifers. The USGS conducted a study where they have estimated the recharge rate, and they've also determined what the age of the aquifer water is in the Chico, in the brown dot here, the Evangeline in the green dot, and in the upside down triangle, brown triangle in the Jasper. So, no surprise, the Chico has the youngest water and the highest recharge rate. As you get a little bit deeper into the Evangeline, you get lower recharge rates, and the water, so all the green dots here, get older. And then in the Jasper, the recharge is less than 2/10 of an inch per year. That's the deepest. That's telling, and the age of the water is, with one exception, is generally much older than the other aquifers, especially the Chico. So what I've done is take this location map again from the USGS. This is a map showing the distribution of the Chico, which, the Evangeline, this is at the surface, the Burkeville confining unit, and the Jasper outcrop. Remember, this is where the Jasper gets its recharge from. So there's a number of numbers, which I know you can't read, is so small. The number of wells have been sampled, and the age of the water using isotope analysis has been determined. So I gathered this data for these, the age of groundwaters. I measured off the distance from the base of the Burkeville, that's where the recharge is. And then if you have an age, a time, a distance, you can calculate an average velocity or speed in feet per day. And the groundwater moves at between 0.003 and 0.011 feet per day. What is that telling us? The Jasper groundwater is fossil water. This water that we see today as groundwater rain was precipitation which occurred before even significant human settlement in the Americas. So this goes back a long time, and this is something to reflect on in terms of what is a sustainable groundwater supply. I mentioned earlier that in the woodlands, we had seen significant decline in the water levels in our aquifers. This is a GPS. This is a GPS station. It's called P13. Up here is a location map. That's in the woodlands. This is Lake Woodlands here, and this is shown in blue. This is Bear Branch Reservoir, 1488, running east to west on the north side of the woodlands. This is Spring Creek and a boundary with Harris County. So this elevation station senses GPS signals from the GPS satellites going around the area, going around the Earth, and it calculates relative to a datum level, what the elevation change is, and the GPS can be accurate up to just a few centimeters. So it's very, very accurate. And what we see over time from late 2000 all the way to the end of 2020 is a decline in surface elevation at this location of, now it's over 25 centimeters, which is the better part of a foot. It's around 10 inches or so of subsidence. So the data points are shown as the black dots, and then an average line is drawn through the middle of the dots. And then just from the period of 2010 to 2019, we've seen 7 to 8 centimeters of subsidence. What is interesting is we were trucking along, subsiding pretty good until about the middle of 2015 or late 2015, when treated surface water became available, and there was a dramatic change in the rate of subsidence. Now, more recently, unfortunately, there has been a slight increase in pumping especially from the Jasper aquifer. and we've seen the subsidence pick up again. It's early days. So this is going to have to be monitored very closely. We're going to have to be making some serious decisions about how we use our groundwater supplies and how we use surface water supplies. And when we combine different water sources, that is described as conjunctive water use. So as I note here, groundwater was the only source of drinking water until late 2015. Now, at that time, late 2015, surface water became available to southern Montgomery County to manage excessive groundwater withdrawal. And I have this timeline here. If we recall, Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District was formed in 2001 with the voter approval to preserve, conserve, and protect our groundwater. And shortly after that, the Lone Star determined that a sustainable pumping rate that would not have deleterious effects would be about 64,000 acre feet per year. So Montgomery County continues to grow, and so there are tremendous water demands being made on the aquifer. So Lone Star at the time developed a plan to reduce groundwater use by 30% by the year 2016, meaning that water utilities, both public and private, would need to find an alternative source. So the San Jacinto River Authority made available all the water for Montgomery County that's in Lake Conroe. That was in 2009. And so we pay $2 million to the city of Houston for their share, which is 2/3 of what's available. 100,000 acre feet, by the way, is available from Lake Conroe for use. SJRA has, who manages Lake Conroe, has 1/3 of that, and the city of Houston has 2/3 of it. So SJRA pays for that option to take all the water, $2 million a year to Houston. So we have then a secure surface water supply. So SJRA finalized a groundwater reduction plan in 2011 and contracted with utilities that supply 80% of Montgomery County residents and businesses with water. And so that put them, the SJRA, into a position to sell bonds guaranteed by the state of Texas and the Texas Water Development Board to construct a surface water treatment plant and water transmission lines from that treatment plant down to the woodlands and other areas in southern Montgomery County requiring it. And that was completed by 2015, and that water became available in the fall of 2015. So you might think, well, happy days are here, everyone lives happily ever after, but alas, this doth be a Shakespearean drama, dost thou not know it? And so begins the game. The cities of Conroe and Magnolia objected to paying fees for groundwater reduction. And those fees, by the way, would be used to repay the bonds. People who lend money to state entities, I think, and reasonably so, expect to be repaid. And that objection began a legal contest that continues today. And then additional lawsuits challenging the legality of the Lone Star rules limiting pumping also were submitted. Now, in 2017, the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District enabling legislation was amended there in 2017, changing the appointed board of directors to an elected board. And the question is, how did this come about? We don't really know for sure who got to get in there and make these changes, but they were made. The new board was elected in 2018. The campaign of these board members was funded by a political action committee called Restore Affordable Water, or it's called RAW, and it was run by at least one private utility company. Now, in these lawsuits that were ongoing, in 2019, there was a visiting judge in the 248th District Court here in Montgomery County. He issued a final judgment saying the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District rules were unlawful, void, and unenforceable. And this is being appealed or has been appealed. There's lawsuits continuing. It's just crazy. So the elected board is now focused on private property rights. Remember that, the rule of capture and all the rest of it regarding groundwater pumping. Now, earlier this year, a couple of months ago, the GMA 14 issued recommendations for DFC's desired future conditions in the current planning cycle, allowing for greater pumping, 100,000 acre-feet a year and more, and which is extraordinary, having already seen that a sustainable pump rate was 64,000. And the new board wants to avoid any kind of subsidence metric that is part of the GMA 14 proposed DFCs. And that's where things are right now. So this process of approving DFCs is ongoing. You will have until July 19th to submit your comments to Lone Star. That becomes part of the record that goes to the state, Texas Water Development Board. The next meeting of GMA 14 is in October of this year. And so we'll see where this goes. But notwithstanding what is going on locally, conjunctive water use in Montgomery County is the future. That is it. Now the SGRA has done some studies showing what our needs are, will be in the future. The red line is projected demand from SGRA customers, and the total demand is for the entire county shown in green. As you can see, the vast majority of the county residents and businesses is supplied by SGRA. And what these horizontal bars are showing are different water sources that are available. So we have groundwater. The groundwater should be a little bit higher. It should be a little bit over 50. It should be 64. We have the SGRA share of Lake Conroe available. We have the option from the city of Houston, which is shown in blue. And then way out in the future, we start to pick up the Catahoula, surface water from Lake Livingston, which we brought by pipeline and channels over the watershed between the Trinity and San Jacinto rivers. Then there are return flows that be, for example, industrial water, perhaps unused, especially if there's some conservation measures, reuse water, the purple pipe stuff, and then finally aquifer storage and recharge. So way out in the future. Now, if the SGRA did not acquire various rights and options, this is what our situation would look like with what is conceivably available. So the city of Houston water and Livingston water are gone out of this picture. So there's a need for conjunctive use of groundwater. It's absolutely critical if we are going to continue to grow and sustain our populations. So to summarize, groundwater management and ownership has a long and tortuous history. Groundwater is private property here in Texas, subject to some regulation and legal constraints. Now, we've come a long way from a worldview, for some, that groundwater is secret, occult, and concealed. It really is part of the hydrologic cycle, which we intercept by pumping groundwater, and that is well understood today. Overexploitation of groundwater brings risks related to aquifer compaction, resulting in land subsidence and water level lowering, loss of base flow, for example, in rivers. There are multiple layers of water planning, including groundwater planning, and the Texas Water Development Board and TCEQ are critical to this whole process of planning and particularly enforcement. And managing groundwater, as we've seen locally, here in Montgomery County, it is a challenge because of that established rule of capture. And that brings me to a close. So how do I stop? Here we go.
I think that's fascinating, Neil, personally.
How do I hand back to you? Do you just take it back from me or what?
No, I didn't take it back at all. You still have control. All I did was unmute my microphone.
Oh, okay. Well, how do I get it? Oh, you are the host. You're still the host. Okay, I see. Very good.
Do you need to be the host again?
No. I'm done. I see there's some questions in the
Yeah, you see the chat. Maybe before you answer the questions, I want to maybe frame some discussion for the group that's here as well as online. The mandate challenge of being a master naturalist is that we don't take political positions, right? This is all about volunteer conservation with our sponsoring partners. But that doesn't mean you ignore the political realities of stuff that's going on. I've heard enough about the background material of the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District and a lot of the debates going on back and forth. I'm also have a background in geology, just like Neil. And so I've got an appreciation for that, and especially because Ron and I are part of a large conservation project for Lake Livingston, trying to preserve that because the city of Houston's gone through this story already. All this subsidence stuff, you have one homework assignment. You ought to go home and Google the Brownwood subdivision in Baytown and the Baytown Nature Center and find out how it became the Baytown Nature Center, why it became the Baytown Nature Center, and how much subsidence happened there because of commercial groundwater pumping. It's should be a lesson that Montgomery County ought to heed well. So just take a look at that. That's for fun. It's an interesting story, and I've been to that nature center, and there's a hill in the middle of it, and halfway up there's a big bronze plaque that shows you where the original ground level was before it sunk. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. So that being said, water is an important master naturalist topic, understanding where it comes from and groundwater and surface water and all this stuff, because our drinking water depends on it. I continue to be, as a lowly layman, terribly impressed with what the Woodlands has done. I didn't know anything about the Woodlands Environmental Services Department that Terry is an integral part of. I don't know anything about the conservation efforts, and it puzzles me today that as important as water is in a state as dry as Texas, why a city of 5.5 million people doesn't have a water conservation program, if nothing else, just to teach people how to be not so stupid, like me and watering my grass and doing all the dumb things I've done in my life. So I could have used a lot of the education that the Woodlands brings to the table. I could have used a lot of the education that Neil has been talking about. And the first question I want to ask Neil to comment on is, so when you get into some of these specific debates on groundwater versus surface water, doesn't the Texas Water Development Board have jurisdiction over these municipalities so that they can affect the neighboring communities with however they decide to do things just to save money?
Great question. The Texas Water Development Board has only limited enforcement authority. Primarily, that is through ensuring that plans are what is called administratively complete. Otherwise, they would be rejected. TCEQ, on the other hand, does have enforcement authority. And if it can be demonstrated that there are policies resulting in undesirable outcomes, then I think they can step in a direct way. But the bar for them to take action with regard to groundwater is extremely high. It's a very difficult and challenging arena, and it's centered around the private property issue of basically someone owns land, owns the groundwater, and it's managing that is the biggest challenge of all. I think I mentioned in the presentation that the core of the issue is whether or not Texas is ready to move from the rule of capture to the rule of reasonable use, or the American rule. And that is a fraught and difficult and challenging issue to change, because there are interests who are clearly not interested in the slightest in having a new approach to groundwater management. As I said, we're in the world of the law of the biggest pump, and that's what it is.
Do you have any comparisons, having been in the Houston area? The federal government mandated that they had to invest a lot of money in all their sewage systems and aging infrastructure and all that stuff. The cost of water I had at my place in West Houston was easily rivaling my utility bill every month, easily. So I have no idea, not having ever lived in Montgomery County, is the cost of water in Montgomery County really high, or is it just nominal?
Well, for someone using, let's say about 10,000 gallons a month, which is roughly the average use on an annualized basis here, I think they can reasonably expect to pay about $100, perhaps a little more than that, so something on that order. So I don't look upon it as an exceptional cost. Of course, if the more water you use, the higher your monthly water bill is going to be. Mine is a lot less than that. I pay around $60 to $70 a month typically.
So prior to the discussion on where the water comes from in Montgomery County, why did the Woodlands have a big conservation program underway in the first place? If it wasn't, was it due to subsidence, or was it due to other reasons?
Oh, well, perhaps Terry could address this more directly, but I think the realization was that water at the time, it was all groundwater. A lot of it was being wasted. Most of our water gets used to water St. Augustine grass. I have zoysia in my lawn, by the way. But a lot of that water, because people do overwater, it goes down the storm sewers. And so it was realized that, we've really got to educate people to better manage how they use water. and particularly with irrigation. And the Woodlands has established a controlled days for irrigation. 2 days a week, certain hours, and odd and even addresses. So that's been enforced for some time, and that has knocked down considerably the water use. So subsidence hasn't really come into play in a major way until more recently. The general discussion around it is that people realize the more you pump, the more the land surface will subside due to greater compaction in the aquifers. So and so that is a real issue out there. I need to mention one thing. There definitely is a link between subsidence and the severity of flooding in major events. That is not really a surprise because of changes in drainage patterns, especially in metropolitan areas. The Houston-Galveston Subsidence District is currently conducting a study on the risk of flooding along the Spring Creek corridor due to due to subsidence. And that of course relates back to excess groundwater pumping. Now, in December, the San Jacinto, Harris County Flood Control District conducted a upper San Jacinto watershed study to analyze flooding and they analyzed it with a hydrologic model using the new NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall tables. And it was found, the short story is, it was found that the new 100-year flood with the new rainfall tables is approximately equivalent to that of the old 500-year flood level. So if you add subsidence, and especially relative subsidence, to that mix, you've increased your risk of flooding along that corridor potentially significantly. And it only takes a couple inches in water in a home to cause tens of thousands of dollars of damage. So anyway, that's an important piece of this whole discussion. So it's emerged fairly recently, but in terms of conservation, I think it's just something that makes good sense.
Hey, Scott, I've got 3 comments if I could jump in.
3, you're only allowed 1.
Well, if I was to do one, I'd congratulate Neil on an outstanding presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, same here. Take on all of us.
The second comment, ignoring your comment, is that he called the tranche of water that he had in there in the future, the surface water, he called it Conroe. Basically, that's the diversion of the use of Lake Conroe from Houston to Montgomery County.
Right.
Since water is fungible, that means that Houston is going to make that up by taking more water from Livingston. So really, that tranche is Livingston just as much as the other one that he talked about, because of the fact that the water is to some degree at least fungible. The third comment was kind of related to yours, and that is to point out that I can take as much water as I can pump from the Lake Livingston through a 2-inch pipe continuously. I pay $150 a year to be able to do that. The state of Texas, the people in Texas, and for that matter, the United States and pretty much the world, value water at 0. what you're paying for all the time is the infrastructure, the pumping, the cleaning of the water, all of the infrastructure that is being invested in, the bonds that Neil mentioned that have to be paid back. That's what you're paying for in the water, but the water itself, everybody thinks is free. And as long as we continue to think that, conservation won't necessarily have a lot of teeth. That's all.
With that, I'm sure we've had a long morning and now you're assuredly experts in water. We'll have a test next time. But no, I always enjoy this session for sure, because I think water is an important topic for all of us, for Master Naturalists. And especially I wanted you to hear, this is the first time we had Neil to do this. And I think it's quite something if you dig into all of the issues you see maybe in the newspapers here in Montgomery County. But you need to know, and it's part of our conservation discussion. Neil, thanks again. Ron, thanks again. We're going to have our next class in a couple of weeks. We're not sure where it's going to be, so I'll send you all an email. Carolyn is trying to investigate maybe getting a larger venue so we could have more in-person attendees. You're going to be, if you're water experts now, you're going to be Botany 101 experts after that. Anita Tiller, who works at Mercer, who's a master's degree botanist, is going to be your teacher and everything you want to know about botany, but we're afraid to ask. And I didn't think that it was going to be interesting when I went through it. And now you use the fundamentals of that when you start going, what's this bush? What's this tree? What's this grass? And there's different lessons learned that I learned that came out of that. So I think you'll enjoy it. Tentatively, we might have it at the Woodlands Emergency Management Center, which is across the highway. It's got a huge meeting room, so it's not this small. And just for reference, when we used to have classes here, we'd have 35 people in here, 35 to 40. So times have changed this year a little bit. Yes, Don.
We also mentioned Savannah and I are going to bring some water and maybe little snacks for the next meeting.
Is that okay?
Absolutely. And historically, like we reduced your dues. Historically, we would actually furnish snacks and stuff and have a coffee pot going in the back. This has just been a different year for all of us, right? Different year and a half. So it's always welcome. Yeah. Oh, gee, our president showed up on the screen. That means she must want to talk to all of us. So deferring to our president.
So the one thing I wanted to mention, Jennifer Seal is very involved with keeping track of the political climate around water in Montgomery County. And she has added some notes in the chat for us. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to go ahead and capture the chat and send it to everyone who has attended all of our intern class, so you can hear what she has to say about the politics involving water here in Montgomery County. And one of the things that she would like to do is urge you as a private citizen to get involved.
The last thing I would add to Jennifer's ideas and proposals, anybody in the class that's interested in knowing and being involved a little bit more in water, please reach out to the famous Terry MacArthur, our longtime chapter training director and past president. And she is the resource for you to do stream team training, to do wetlands and water conservation and a host of other things. So please reach out to her. So anything else, Carolyn?
That was it. I'm so glad to have seen the people who were here in person. Yay.
So, all right, we'll adjourn. Thank you all. Thank you all online. It's been fun. Neil, Ron, thank you a whole lot. We really appreciate the education today. So talk to you all later.
Bye. Bye. Thank you all.
Bye, guys.